Hey, welcome everybody. Yes, I am trying something new. If you guys haven't noticed, I have a little new intro and I got a little new layout. Uh, yeah, I figure, it's 2021, got to keep up to date, got to keep modern. So I'm going to try something called the discussion table where we just kind of bring somebody on and have a discussion about it. Today I have the wonderful Scott Clifton, who will be joining us about an hour. We want to get done before the Super Bowl here, so people have to watch that. But I had told Scott earlier that I don't mind him being smarter than me, but I can't have him being prettier than me. So I was doing my hair, and he had to take an extra 10 minutes to do his, and I noticed this. So
It was very important to me to one up you.
obviously, yes, it's okay. I don't mind that people are prettier than me, but I tell you what, I took me about 5 years to grow this, so I'm pretty content.
I'm working on mine. Okay, I'm
It looks
working
great.
on
No,
it.
it's
I'll get there.
fabulous. It's fabulous. Perfect as usual. So, anyways, let me kind of give people a breakdown of why we're doing this. The other day, I noticed that you on Twitter, under theoretical bullshit, which you use for basically your philosophy stuff, that you had said something that just made my day. You had basically been saying what I've been trying to impart to people for about 5 years now, that philosophically speaking, the most commonly understood, the normative understanding of what we ought to use to understand a paper would be atheism as the belief that God does not exist. And I think there's some virtue to that. I think there's a lot of virtues to having the position that atheism is the belief rather than just merely lacking a belief. So I thought I'd bring you on, kind of have you explain why you have that position. Now, I don't know if you had that before when you were talking to like Matt on the atheist experience, but by the props to Mr. Brass for that thumbnail. Love that thumbnail for this video. But I thought people may call in and kind of ask us questions about that and talk about the virtues of having atheism as a belief versus like lack of belief.
Yeah, by the way, I'm new to this fight. This is not, I never really had a dog in this fight. Even when I took the sort of opposite position that I take now, I didn't. There's no magic dictionary in the sky. There's no right or wrong way to assign a meaning to an arbitrary string of consonants and vowels. But I think there are, we have certain intuitions about what certain words vaguely mean to us, and we try to create the best definition we can that's going to make the most sense to the most amount of people and create the least amount of confusion possible. And I think anyway, this tweet that you're talking about was just the other day, and all I was saying was that for most of my life, at least as long as I've known the word atheist, I don't think I knew the word atheist before I was like 14 or 15 or something like that. But for most of my life, I just treated atheist. I just took atheist to be literal. You have the prefix meaning without or not, and then the word theist meaning I'm not a theist, and that seemed perfectly reasonable to me. I didn't see any issues with that. I didn't even see any issues with the idea of saying that a rock is atheistic, right? It's like just like a rock is apolitical. That seemed perfectly fine to me to say that. So that wasn't like a reductio ad absurdum that I had an issue with. And then I sort of understood agnosticism to be both compatible with atheism and theism. You can have like the four quadrants where you can have a gnostic theist and an agnostic theist, and gnostic atheist and an agnostic atheist, meaning I don't believe in God but I don't know one way or another, or I do believe but I don't claim to know, or I do believe and I do claim to know, and so on and so forth. um, but the difference between, I think, the way I would use that language and the way that I am seeing the language being used now, which is what prompted this tweet, was that even though I would say, well, what I mean by atheist is someone who just has an absence of belief in God, I'm still more than just an atheist because I do have the belief, even when I would say it, atheist is just non-theism. I would say, but I'm not just that, because clearly I do have a belief that no gods exist. I don't claim to know that no gods exist, and my feelings are stronger about certain gods than other gods. I feel obviously more strongly that the Christian God does not exist than I do just a sort of general vague theism. But I'm an atheist because I lack belief in God, but I'm more than just an atheist because I also have the positive belief that no gods exist, and that was the way I would frame it. Now I'm hearing a lot. I think I'm hearing people who identify as atheists saying, uh, I just lack belief in God. I have no, and it sounds like what they're saying is I have no propositional attitude at all towards theism, right? Like I
Right.
have no belief one way or another about whether God exists. I don't believe in God, but I also don't believe that there are no gods. And that would be fine. That to me sounds like how I would prefer to use the word agnostic now, which I guess I'll get to that.
Hmm.
But the issue with that is that once you start engaging, or I mean, I'm not the one engaging, but once I see some of these people using the language this way start to engage, it becomes very clear that they believe that no gods exist. And so then I started just speculating about, okay, how is this word then being used, and what is the purpose for wanting, fighting so hard to define it this way? And it must be some kind of anxiety about having the burden of proof. That
Hmm.
it just seems like that's the most reasonable explanation for the kinds of people that fight so hard for the so-called lack theist definition. Anyway, that aside for a second, in most recent years, I should say, I've just started using. It just seems cleaner and easier, and I've just started adopting the language in the way that Graham Oppy
Hmm.
does, which is,
Love Graham.
I yeah, and I've
Great.
really he's only come on my radar. I've known about him for years and years, but I only like bought a book of his, in the last 6 months or so. I never really read anything he wrote, and I just really appreciate the simplicity of how he defines theist, atheist, and agnostic. It's just so much cleaner and easier, and I think less confusing in conversation. You're an atheist if you have the belief that there are no gods. You're a theist if you have a belief in some god or another, and you're an agnostic if you're genuinely neutral or undecided about it, and you're not sure either way. Whereas before, I would have said, all agnostics are atheists by definition, because if you don't believe in God, then you're an atheist. So yeah, that's where I'm at. And again, anytime somebody begins to tell me that no, that's not the right word, this is the right word, this is what this means, I just go, okay, in conversation, fine, we'll just use the word your way. But when you're not looking to really define and unpack words, I've found it simpler lately to just say I'm an atheist because I have a belief that no gods exist.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to unpack there. I love the way you put that. And by the way, Graham has been a guest on the show before, and he was amazing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, huge fan of Graham Oppy. Okay, so let me touch on a few things. One, yeah, you're exactly right. Words are descriptive, right? Or definitions are descriptive of words, right? Most dictionaries are not prescriptive dictionaries. They did used to exist, but nowadays what they use is called sensu lato, which means very generic or wide usage, wide scope, I guess you can say, of a word. A very narrow use would be what's called sensu stricto or sensu strictissimo, but it uses what's called the synchronic versus diachronic approach, which is synchronic. Synchronic is how a word is used today, versus diachronic, which is how it's used over time. And so when we look at a dictionary, people say, oh, look, Steve, here's the dictionary, here's Google. What they're not understanding is that's merely giving a description of how the word is being used in the world. And there's no question that there are atheist groups that use atheism as merely lack of belief. That's a fact. I mean, that's what they use. It doesn't mean that it's prescribed that way. And they seem to not understand the difference between descriptivism and prescriptivism. And you're right, there are people out there that say, look, you must use this words this way. But words are just signifiers. They represent something, right? And they have no intrinsic value of themselves or meaning to themselves other than what we ascribe to them by usage, right? And the Graham Oppy said the exact same thing before. I noticed you had said something earlier that you used to subscribe to things like agnostic theism and gnostic atheism, and as you may well know, I mean, I just think those phrases are either nonsensical, superfluous, or ambiguous at best. The reason being is, and hopefully people can call. By the way, when you guys call, I might have to change things around because I just realized I'm going to really change out my layout here. Hey, it's new. So trial and error, but that's fine. The number to call in is on the video description and on the screen, and put your PIN number in and we'll get you in for questions. But the whole agnostic atheism thing, I have to ask people, why do they want, like you before, why do people want to juxtapose like epistemology and ontology, two different propositions, right? Because there's a proposition there about God existing, which is an ontological question, right? It's an existential question, does God exist? Which has been the question, the great debate question for thousands of years. Why do they have to throw in this thing about knowledge? It's a completely different question whether we think that gods are knowable or not, right? So when I ask people, when they say like, oh, I'm agnostic atheist, and I say, well, I just care about your ontology. What do you think about the question of God existing? And their brains freeze.
Yeah, well, I'd see that even that's confusing when you say, I'm going to ask you about your ontology, and then you go, what do you believe? Even that can get kind of lost in translation because you're not really asking about ontology.
Yeah, it's about
You're
doxastic
asking
state.
what they believe about.
Yeah, the doxastic
right?
state about ontology, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I suspect that a lot of this may come from anxiety as a result of a misunderstanding of how burdens of proof work. Just because you have a propositional belief, that no gods exist, doesn't mean anytime you come into conversation with anyone about it, you now have a burden to prove that that belief is true. That's not how it works.
Right.
If you were going to make an argument for the idea that no gods exist, well, then of course you have a burden of proof. Or if you make any specific claim within a greater conversation, well, then of course you have a burden of proof. But that's, yeah, that rarely is it going to be the case that just because you have a belief that no gods exist, you now have to demonstrate that. And the theist gets to just sit back,
Yeah.
and
well,
go,
you only have to
okay,
demonstrate
well,
something if you claim you can demonstrate it. And that's where I think there's a lot of confusion with the burden of proof. I know a lot of groups out there just really shy away from having a burden of proof. They misunderstand what that means. It doesn't mean to prove anything. It means to justify your belief as rational is basically what it means. And so when you're saying, well, what is your burden of proof? You're just asking somebody, what is your reasoning for why you hold a position? And including your non-position. I've actually demonstrated, I think quite effectively in my blogs, that even holding an agnostic position has a burden of proof as why you fail to affirm or deny the proposition, why you've suspended judgment. That requires a burden of proof. But these are not unassailable high bars to meet. You believe there are no gods. I'm sure you can meet your burden of proof for that. It doesn't mean you have to show there are no gods. It doesn't mean you need some logical argument. It just means, hey, do you have some reasons that you feel are sufficient to warrant you believing there are no gods? That's it.
Yeah, maybe, but a lot of people don't see it that way. And sure, I've been having these conversations for most of my life, right? So for me, it's not that difficult to show that I have good reasons
Oh,
for
absolutely.
thinking
Yeah.
I do. But I had one person. We're talking about those tweets that I sent out. I had one person respond, a young lady who said, "Listen, I spent most of my life as an evangelical Christian making all kinds of claims about the world that I now know or that I now have come to believe were garbage. And I'm paraphrasing what she said, but she's like, I have PTSD from this sort of confidence, this epistemic confidence
Mm-hmm.
that I had, and I just want to be able to believe. It's true. I do believe that there are no gods. If somebody says, here's the proposition, there are no gods, do you believe this?
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that that's true? She would say, yes, I believe that that's true, but I don't want to be seen as claiming that there are no gods. And so that's an
Right, and
important
I don't see it. I
distinction.
don't think there's a distinction though. And I like what you said before. You don't have an onus to convince anybody of anything. If you were just giving an autobiographical state of your doxastic beliefs, and you just say, look, I believe there are no gods. You have no onus to try to persuade anybody, right? It's still a claim, but it's a claim to yourself, more or less, than somebody else, right? You have a burden of persuasion only if you're trying to persuade somebody to accept your claim.
Well, there's two claims. There's a claim, like you said, there's a claim about your psychology.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there are no gods. Do I have to prove
No,
that?
we kind of think
No,
people assume
we can
that
kind of
for an
take your
honest
word for
interlocutor.
it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right,
Yeah. I'm not lying to you that I believe
right.
there are no
Although I get
gods.
accused of being a theist all the time. I got accused of that today. I'm
Yeah.
lying about my position. I'm actually a closet theist. Shh, don't tell anybody.
You're that's yeah, you're sneaking in. You're
I
the Trojan
know,
horse of atheism.
man.
Uh, but that's different from so that's saying I don't believe or I believe there are no gods is a psychological claim about me.
Hmm.
That's different from saying there are no gods. That's not a claim about me. That's a claim about the world.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And I think those two they actually do have different meanings. They're kind of different categories of claim. And I think a lot of people want to be able to say the first one without having to be committed to making the second claim.
It is an
And the
ontological
way that they
commitment,
do
though,
that,
isn't it, though?
I don't think so. I think you can. I think if I'm just claiming, I'm making a psychological claim about my subjective experience, which is it is an objective fact that I, Scott, believe that there are no gods. That's different from claiming there are no gods. I think one is even though it's the same subject matter, one is a statement about the world, and the other is just a statement about me. You can even say, you can even claim, I believe there are no gods, but I'm probably wrong. you know,
That
but
seems odd. That you're probably wrong. You have a belief that you're convinced of, but you're that means you kind of hold the probability to be more of the case.
here's an example of that. Have you heard of it wasn't Derek Parfit. It was who wrote Nick Bostrom, right?
Nick
Nick
Bostrom.
Bostrom has this or not a thought, he has an argument that if in terms of just sheer
Simulation
probability,
theory. Yeah, simulation
we're
theory
in a
guy. Yeah,
simulation, right?
yeah.
It's a very compelling argument,
Hmm.
right? But I
Right.
can still say that's a good example, right? Because I can say I believe that I'm not in a simulation, but taking Bostrom's argument seriously, I'm probably wrong,
Well, okay,
right?
I like that.
So
I think it's more. He argues that I think it's 3 or 4 propositions that he has, and one of them has to be false, right? Not all the. I think you can't. The way he argues it is not all of his propositions for simulation theory can be true. So it's a logically inconsistent system. So something has to give. Something has to be false. So I too believe we're not in a simulation, but which premise do you deny, right?
Well, exactly. And what if and all the premises seem plausible? I mean, every single one of those premises in that argument seems more plausible than its alternative. And even though he's saying something's got to be one of these
Hmm.
premises have to be wrong if we're not in a simulation, that's just us starting with the assumption that we're not in a simulation
It
and
does,
going,
right,
okay,
right, yeah.
since we're not in a simulation, one of these premises has to be wrong. But anyway, so I'm just trying to illustrate that there can be a conceptual difference between saying that X is true and I believe X is true. One is a claim about me, the other is a claim
Yeah, one's
about the
one's
world.
one's one's about the radicality of reality, right? But what happens if somebody said, "Well, do you think it is the ontological state of the universe that God does not exist?" I don't think there's a difference. I think there's kind of a difference without a distinction there to be had. I agree with you. There's the truth, the veracity of the claim, and then there's the psychological state, and they are different things. And if you're just giving somebody your psychological state, look, I believe there's no gods. To me, it's still affirming the state of reality, right? Still saying that yes, I do think it is the case that reality exists. You are claiming that in some ways. I think the distinction is that when you are having these discussions with a theist, they try to just say, "Oh, look, you're making a claim, therefore you have to somehow prove that no gods exist," which is absurd. The same thing when an atheist says, "Hey, hey theist, you have to prove God exists." Well, a theist would only have to do that if that's their claim, right? I mean, they would have no onus to prove anything. As they say, look, I can prove God exists, and I'll sit back and go, "Oh, okay, I'm interested in that. What's your proof of that?"
But you're but I so I know that you're, I mean, just from this conversation alone, I could tell that you're a little uncomfortable with the distinction I'm making
I see
here.
your distinction. Yes.
And no, you see the
Hmm.
distinction, but I think the reason that you're uncomfortable with it is that it does feel to you like if I say I believe there are no gods, that doesn't feel a lot different, like a much different claim than me saying there are no gods. And but that distinction is what gets us this big battle over the definition of atheism. I mean, a lot of people want to be able to make a statement about their psychology without making, and if we don't allow them to have that distinction, right? I mean, if we insist to somebody, if you're telling me that you believe there are no gods, then what you're telling me is that there are no gods. And if that's true, then they do have the burden of proof. I mean, if saying I believe there are no gods is logically equivalent, has the same propositional content as saying there are no gods, then I am actually making a claim about metaphysics and not just my own psychology. And that claim does have a burden of proof. And I think people don't want to be in that position. And so that distinction is important. I want to be able to make a claim about my psychology, but I don't want to be making a claim about metaphysics.
I think they're the same, though. I think that one's relating to the other. I think I hate to say the word entailment. It's not really an entailment. It's an implication. I think there's an implication there when I'm giving my dosastic self-assessment, so to speak, right? I'm giving you my psychological state. I think there's an implication there that I'm also telling you that this is my ontological position as well. I am making the claim that there are no gods. But I think we could probably word it as better. I could give you the psychological state that let's put on my atheist hat for a second, right? And I say, look, I'll say I'm an atheist and I believe there's no gods. And that means I'm telling you my psychological state, or I can word it that way, but I'm not trying to persuade anybody. And I think what you're trying to make the distinction is if I say, look, there are no gods, and you're saying, well, you're not just giving me your autobiographical or self-assessment. What you're doing is you're making a claim that there's no gods. What's your evidence for that? But that's more toward evidentialism. And that's only going to be, I would think, if I'm trying to persuade you. If I say, hey, Scott, there are no gods, and you say, okay, well, persuade me of that, and I want to persuade you, then that's where that burden comes in, right? But if I'm saying, hey, there are no gods, that's the way the universe is, I don't think I have an onus to persuade anybody. I don't have a burden of proof to persuade anybody. I have an epistemic burden to myself to justify it, right? But I think the distinction is that the burden of persuasion there. Are you trying to persuade your interlocutor to comport with your position?
Well, so okay, so if you and I, we go on a camping trip and we're just sitting around a campfire, roasting marshmallows.
Let's do it,
and,
man.
Yeah, we'll make it happen sometime.
Yeah.
And you say to me, and let's say I'm a theist, I'm a Christian, and you're you. If you say to me, we're just having casual conversation, and you say, yeah, I believe that there are no gods, but anyway, blah blah blah. That is different from you saying, "Hey, Scott, there are no gods." It feels different conversationally. I feel like it has different implications. If you said, I'm an atheist, I believe there aren't any gods, I would let that go in conversation. I would just go, oh yeah, sure, totally, I believe you. Got it. Copy that. Understood. But if you say, hey, Scott, there are no gods, well, then I think I have the right to say, give me the reasons why you think that's true.
See, I think
Whereas I
there.
don't have the right to say that if you just said, I believe.
I don't think having the modifier "I believe" really changes anything, right? Because I mean, when I say there are no gods, I'm still giving you my dosastic state. I mean, I'm telling you that's my belief, right?
Okay, how about this? Okay, I ran into a guy. I took my son. I have a 4-year-old son, and I was at the park with him, and we ran into this other dad. And this guy is a full-blown believer, Christian, even and he's one of those people that has a hard time understanding that not everyone in the world shares his worldview.
I've met a few of those. Yes.
Yeah,
both
so
atheist and theist.
Yeah, and he'd say things in conversation like, isn't God great? I just thank the Lord every day, and I would let that slide, enough times, and then eventually, if he prodded me enough, I would go, oh, okay, well, I totally hear you. I don't, believe in God, but I take your point, or something like that. But imagine how different it would be if he said, isn't God great? And I go, there is no God. That's a very different. That's more different.
Yeah, that's more of a. I mean, it's one thing to have a discussion about what somebody wants to talk about, right? If they're saying, "Look, I want to talk about God," And you're just like, look, there is no God. I don't want to have a discussion about it, right? But if that's usually two people with very diametrically opposite positions, which I do think.
But I think that's not fair. I think it's actually not fair in conversation to say there is no God, but I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I
It
agree with
is
you
fair
that.
to
Right.
say,
Yeah.
it is fair to say, I happen to believe that there are no gods, but I don't want to talk about it. That seems totally
Yeah,
legit
I
to
don't have
me.
a
You
problem
can
with that.
say that.
Yeah.
So to me, I mean, even just intuitively, the distinction I think really matters between making a claim about metaphysics and making a claim about your own psychology. And I'm guessing that that's where the
Disconnect.
sort of investment people
Or
have in this battle over definitions
all
comes
right, so let
from.
me ask you this: do you think that? And by the way, feel free to call in people. The numbers on the thing. And again, I'm gonna have to change things around when somebody does. But do you, for example, I know you're familiar with like deflationary theories of truth. Do you think there's a difference between somebody saying it is true that there's no God and just there is no God? Because in deflationary theory, those are the exact same sentences,
Yeah, no,
right?
by the way, you're giving me too much credit. I'm not that familiar with the
Oh,
subject,
okay.
but yeah,
Well,
no,
yeah,
but
no,
I
I
think it
don't give
is
you too much. You,
true.
dude, I'm gonna tell you right now. As somebody who has never been formally trained in philosophy, you are legit one of the best minds I've ever seen on the topic. How well you pick it up.
Thanks, man. No,
I'm still
I
prettier
promise
than
I wasn't.
you, but you do know these topics very well.
You do have that on me.
Yes. Smug, my
I
smug
wasn't.
cup, my smug. Do you see that? By the way, my.
I've got my like Joe Rogan knockoff
Nice.
apparently, or whatever that is. Uh, what was I saying there? Yeah, no, I think I agree that there is a dog over there is logically equivalent to it is true that there
Right.
is a dog over there,
Right.
but it's not logically equivalent to I believe there is a dog over there.
Yeah, not logically equivalent. I mean, obviously there's a predication there because you're solidifying that dotastic state. But when I understand about propositions, when like from Russell's view, if I'm not mistaken, somebody who says the dog is over there, they are relating merely a dotastic state, is the way I understand it.
So how about this? So if I say this is a mug, right? I've just given you a proposition. This is a mug, and I say that I
Mm-hmm.
say this is a mug. Uh, am I? Oh God damn it!
In
I
speech, I
completely
mean, in
forgot
speech act
my
theory, you're
question.
making an assertion, right? You're making a declarative that this is a mug. Now, in theory, of course, you don't have to
Oh,
have
I
the
know what I
same
was.
dotastic state. Right? I mean, there are things like what's called peculiar reasoner or Moore's paradox, but I mean, it would seem to be the case, right, for an honest interlocutor, a rational person. And if you say this is a cup, I'm going to kind of hold the implicature that you also believe that. It doesn't necessarily entail
Okay,
that, though.
okay. So here's the question though. It's not. Yeah. If I say this is a cup, obviously I believe it. The question is, is this a knowledge claim? Not just belief, but knowledge. If I say this is a cup, not I believe this is a cup, but if I just say, Steve, this is a cup, does that imply that I am claiming to know this is a
No,
cup?
not at all. Matter of fact, again, knowledge claim is completely different, right? Knowledge is a subset of belief. So unless you epistemically change that as I know this is a cup, you're not making a knowledge claim. You're just making a belief claim. Hey, we have a caller though.
Oh, good.
Hi,
It did work. Hi, who's this?
Hi,
this is Josie. Hi.
Hey, Josie from
Josie.
Facebook.
Josie.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
different. Is it Josie? Is it the same one I'm thinking of?
Yeah.
The admin? Oh, okay. Yes, this is a admin from, which group are you from? I have so many.
I think it's Theist and Atheist discussion group.
That's it. That's the one. So, anyways, yeah, I was talking to you the
Okay.
other day about some stuff, and she was interested in this. What do you think so far? What do you? Because I think that this was kind of new to you when we were having a discussion on Facebook the other day. I don't remember.
No. Just going over our discussion the other day before I called. I don't know. I was just wondering. It sounded like you think atheists do have some kind of burden of proof.
I do. Yeah, Richard Carrier and I have had that discussion ad nauseum, and he actually is now convinced that all atheists, regardless of their usage of the term, have some type of burden of proof. He argues that it's actually been met, like science has met, like the burden of proof for like gravity theory. But I disagree with him on that. But Scott, do you think that atheists have a burden of proof?
I actually don't even think that sentence makes sense. I don't think that's,
What sentence? What, atheists have a burden of proof?
yeah, I
How
don't
are they
think,
not?
see, like atheists have a burden of proof or Christians have a burden of proof. That's not how the burden of proof works. The burden of proof comes when you make a positive claim. You can, if all the atheists in the world, and we're defining atheists as people who believe there are no gods, if you could have all the atheists in the world, and if none of them are going around telling anyone that there are no gods, they don't have a burden of
Well,
proof.
I think they do that themselves. There's still the epistemic burden of proof to yourself about, is your position rational? If you have a belief that there are no gods, you do have a burden of proof. Maybe not to me or to somebody else, right? Because you're not in a discussion with them. But to yourself, you need to demonstrate, at least to your ability, is my belief rational? This is the whole basis behind what's called street epistemology that Anthony Magdabasso kind of does, right? He goes around trying to get people to justify their beliefs to themselves.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where commandeering the idea of burden of proof and exporting it to a context where it doesn't really, what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is, listen, any belief that you have, you should, you should try to have a rational justification for it. It's better to have a rational justification for your beliefs than to not have it. But to say that somebody has a burden of proof to themselves doesn't even, like, who is imposing this burden? Who is the burden for or to, you know?
I think it's just a fancy way to kind of label it if we're going to kind of textbook how we talk about this. But at the end of the day, if you say something is real, I say, what is that? Can you explain it? And then we go from there, right? So it's less burden of, call it burden of proof, but it's just more that, well, if you're saying it exists, you got to tell me about it. You're the one that's got to tell me what you're talking about here. I don't have to it just seems nonsensical to disprove whatever the heck you're talking about.
Yeah, you have no onus to if somebody says, look, this is the case, you have no onus to demonstrate that they're wrong, right? That would be a form of burden shifting. But would you both agree that, let's put aside the epistemic justifications for a sec. Let's put that aside. But if you have the position that there are no gods, and Scott, you say, hey, look, I believe there's no gods. That's my belief, and I hold there are no gods. And you do want to persuade somebody of that. Do you think that has a burden of proof?
Oh yeah, well, if I'm trying to persuade somebody of that, then of course the burden of proof. If I believe there are no gods and I want you to agree with me, the way it's not cool. Like it is not allowed for me to say, prove me wrong, otherwise I'm right.
Right. That's burden
if I'm
shifting.
trying to get you to agree with me, that's when the burden of proof comes in. That's when, because it's my burden to convince you. It's not your burden to convince me, because I'm the one who wants you to agree with me. You didn't necessarily say you want me to become a Christian, So yeah, that is where you get the burden of proof, not merely.
Now, even no, it's a negative, right? I mean, you're saying there are no gods. You're saying there's a negative condition that exists in the universe. A lot of people think that the burden of proof is only for a positive claim. They're all positive claims. Some people even say there's no such thing as a negative claim. They're all positive in that regard, right?
That's what I was going to say. In this case, you can use deduction or other methods to make it positive. You can analyze everything in the universe and determine that there is not a God in it. It's not so much determining a negative if you have access to all the information.
Yeah, it's an aggregate of
You'd be more considered trying to prove a negative. You just don't have the information.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to prove an existential negative, right? You could say things like, look, I can prove there's no such thing as a square circle because it's logically impossible. And there might be some versions of God that are logically impossible, which you can prove don't exist. But for the most part, when we're talking about some kind of more generic type of God that theists will posit that is logically possible, then yeah, I don't know how you would go about even trying to prove something like that. Matter of fact, if that's the case, it's not only logically possible that God exists, it must be the case that God exists in at least one, but not all possible worlds, right? That's the definition of what a contingent being would be, something that's logically possible that exists in at least one possible world, but not all. But theists will go, one step further. They say God is a metaphysical necessity, which means that God has to exist in all possible worlds. And I think that's where the atheists will probably balk at and going, wait, I don't hold that position that God has to be some kind of metaphysical necessity, right? I mean, even as an agnostic, I don't hold that position. But even as agnostic, I think that there's no reason to say that God has to be a metaphysical necessity.
Then it becomes nonsense, and then okay, but then God doesn't have to make sense to us. What?
That's the theist, I guess. I mean,
yeah,
I don't have a problem with the God concept. I can wrap my mind around quite a few things. I'm just very simple. I'm like, look, if somebody says to me, there's a being that exists that without whom there could be no universe, or was no universe to be, there's something that contingent comes from necessity. So the universe is contingent. I'm fine with that. If that's what they want to posit as a God, that's what I can talk about.
Like a cyclic kind of thing that we just don't quite grasp.
There's a dynamic that this debate can take, and often does take, whether we explicate it or not, or describe it this way or not, which is that you have a theist who believes that God exists, you have an atheist who believes that no God exists. And the atheist can say something like, listen, I'm not interested in proving that no God exists. What I am interested in proving is that the belief in God is not rational, or that the belief in God is unjustified. That what I want to prove here is that your belief in God is unjustified, and the reason I think it's unjustified is because there aren't good reasons for believing in it. At that point in the conversation, actually, the burden does now shift to the theist, because if they want to prove that claim wrong, the only way that claim that there is no evidence for God, or there's no justification for belief in God, the only way to prove that wrong is by showing evidence.
So I think they both have the burden there, right? They both have the burden, because the atheist is saying there's no evidence, and so I think that has a burden to it, because there's evidence on both sides. It's just, how good is that evidence? How convincing is that evidence, right? There's obviously arguments for both sides.
There's a difference between saying there is none and I just don't know of any yet. One's a shut book, and the other's like, I don't know yet.
Well, you can also make that claim too. You can say, it's belief in God is unjustified because there is maybe there is a good reason out there somewhere, but it's not available to us here. And so if you can show me that there is a reason for believing in God that is available to us, that of, then
I would argue it differently. I would argue it if I was an atheist, because I think that borderline is on argument from ignorance. I would say it more, I hold the position there's no gods because I think there's better arguments against their God existing than there is for it.
Okay, no, so an argument from ignorance would be saying God doesn't exist
because he hasn't proven it true yet.
Because there's no reason for believing in him. That's not the inference here. The inference here is there's no reason to believe that God exists, therefore the belief in God is not justified. And that's not an argument from ignorance. That's just an argument.
No, but that's an evidential argument, right? I mean, that's basically, this kind of goes with the Clifford principle. But I still don't think that's a strong reason to not have a belief either way, because there are positions out there all the time that there are no evidence for that we believe.
Oh no, I'm not talking about
necessity though. Like, it's how do I explain it? If you just want to explore the universe and wonder if there are any gods even in another universe, I mean, that's one thing to explore. But a god in another universe has no practical use to us, really, if it's not here. So that's a whole different type.
Well, that'd be a plate of like utility and virtue. Like I subscribe a little bit to the way Oppie argues what's called theoretical virtues. He argues that atheism could be really justified by saying that it's non-parsimonious with things that we know about the universe. It doesn't explain anything. The explanatory power of God is not as good as a naturalistic point of view. And if I was going to be an atheist, that's the approach I would take, to say, look, I believe there's no gods because with theoretical virtues, it is more virtuous or better to hold a position there's no gods and hold a naturalistic point of view, because there's no utility, no virtue in ascribing a deity that doesn't add an explanatory power. That's the way I think Oppie would kind of argue it.
I think it's a bit more like endgame for me. It develops differently, but it does come from, in a way, necessity and looking for a god to connect to, and, talk to and pray to and stuff. But then, over time, just growing up and learning about the world, things like natural science and stuff, yes, it does kind of look different. And when you step back and analyze all of it, I wouldn't say it comes down to just simply because of the natural thing. But I guess some people can look at it just like that alone. But it really does depend on other things. So there's a whole lack of kind of reasons.
Well, let me ask Scott. Scott, do you think if you had to look at the virtues between having a theistic view and an atheist worldview, which I firmly believe that ontological naturalism would entail atheism. Which one do you think is more virtuous or more parsimonious with what we look at with reality, right?
Oh yeah, well clearly I think
you would argue the atheist
naturalism
one.
is more parsimonious.
Yes,
right. Yeah.
And that's I think the best way for atheists to judge, or to kind of go about justifying their position. I think again, as you brought up initially, a lot of atheists are scared of having any type of burden of proof, and I think there's multiple different types of burden of proof. There's not just one type. There's multiple different types and going on at any given time.
Well, if you're going to say atheism and naturalism, whatever, it's all together, then or science, then well, atheists, if you will, scientists are actually looking for proof of all these things in the world. Not necessarily God, but whatever they can find, they're trying to figure out and understand what it is. So if you look at that, then there you are.
Yeah, I don't. Atheism doesn't entail naturalism, but naturalism would entail atheism, right?
Oh, sorry.
And scientists don't have to adhere to naturalism. They do from methodological naturalism, but that just means that they're kind of precluded from having any kind of supernatural causation. Because what scientists do is they look at the universe and say, look, this is what we observe. There's an observation here. I want to be able to explain it. That's it. That's all science does. It explains.
Yeah. It seems to have patterns we've noticed, and it seems to be explainable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we're all on the kind of the same page, where it's maybe wording things differently. But I do think that we all kind of agree that atheists seem to be scared of having any type of burden of proof, and it's kind of maybe up to us to explain to them that, look, it's not that high a bar. I mean, you don't have to prove there are no gods to be an atheist. That is just nonsense. That neither does a theist have to prove there is a God to be a theist. You just have to be able to justify your position. And I think there's some good ways to do that for an atheist, but I don't see that happening. I never get a chance to talk to an atheist that really can justify their position other than saying, well, I have none. It's like, wait, so you have no position?
If someone says, do you believe in this randomly spelled object? And you're like, well, what is that? And they try and explain it, and you fail to understand it time and time again. Are you afraid? Like, is that what you're talking about? If someone just doesn't understand what you're talking about?
Scott, maybe you could try to
I think
there.
For this, I think we're assuming that is there a murder happening over there? I think
Are you okay? Do you need help? Blink twice if you need help. Okay.
Okay. I think we're assuming.
It's okay.
Oh God.
We all got kids. We know what it's like. Yeah.
Now I'm the asshole. Oh no.
No worries. No worries. She's just like, don't I'll meet in between. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, you're good. You're all good. I was trying to be funny and it backfired. I think for the purpose of this, we're assuming that we know what we mean by words like God.
Yeah. In fact, I can't. Go ahead.
You guys assume, but I don't have a clear.
Yeah, that's what the discussion was I was having on Facebook, because I have some issues with calls agnosticism a little bit, because I hate to say this, I'm not saying you specifically, Josie, but I find that atheists who tend to resort to what do you mean by God in this ichtheist type position is a little bit disingenuous.
Well,
and let me explain why, because there's been thousands of years of discussion with the concept of God. We hear the word God, even if somebody say, well, I don't believe you, they have to understand what that word has some connotation to it, right?
Yeah, and here's the thing. I think we're all the Christian and whatnot, and I do have like a vague notion, but kind of like my daughter, I have some different mental understanding of things, and I do happen to understand things in a very literal sense. And so when things are not literal, I don't understand them very well.
Okay, so let me ask you
my
this.
daughter who has autism.
Do you believe that there is a metaphysically necessary being that exists, that has agency, that without whom the universe could not or would not exist? Do you believe that?
No, I don't think so. It's hard to grasp with that.
Okay, if Scott didn't exist, would the universe still exist? I mean, he might think not, but but for the most part, Scott can not exist and the universe will still exist. It's not dependent upon his existence, right? Contrary to whom you may ask.
I can't say for sure God didn't do it, so I can't.
No, you don't need surety. Woo, somebody's not happy today. She's like, no, you're ignoring me. No, it's fine. No, you don't have to have surety. It's not a matter of surety. It's a matter of do you believe that God doesn't, that particular being doesn't exist?
I don't know if it exists. I don't feel like I have enough information to determine that for sure, if that makes sense.
But it sounds like the claim you're making is that with enough information about what is meant by God, then you could say, I believe that does not exist.
What information would you think you would be required? I mean, there's a lot of arguments against the existence of God, are there not?
Let's just say I had all the information in the universe. I mean, then I can determine, right? Or
you shouldn't need all the information in the universe. You should just need all the information about what the word God means, right? Because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about, do you have enough information to make a judgment about the existence of God in the same way that you can make a judgment about the existence of Joe Biden? Do you have enough information? You know what
I believe Joe Biden exists, right?
No,
I'm convinced of it.
No, like that. I guess. I get the metaphysical thing. Like, again, I'm literal. Like, a metaphysical being doesn't make sense to me. I guess it's contradictory.
Okay, so you're okay. So I think your hang up is that issue there. Yeah.
Well, no, but if you think it's contradictory, then you have a belief that it doesn't exist.
Correct. To be rational.
My brain is trying to picture it. It's like,
right.
It's like trying to picture a square circle. It's not picturing in my head. I don't know.
Right, but square circles can't exist.
Right.
So if you believe God can't exist, then by definition you believe God doesn't exist.
Well, I would say to be rational.
I have a visual kind of mind. I'm seeing it in my mind. I'm not seeing a square circle.
You can believe you can be in a diatheistic state and have contradictory beliefs. But I mean, what Scott's trying to tell you is that if you think that God is some kind of logical contradiction, to be rational, you have to hold a position that being is impossible.
And therefore it doesn't.
And therefore it doesn't exist, right?
Or
does it make sense?
I haven't figured out why. Like, something could appear illogical to me, but I may have missing factors.
But if you hold it to be illogical, right? I mean, I think a square circle is illogical.
At this time. Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
Hey, sorry to butt in here. I had like 6 cups of coffee this morning.
Oh, dude, I'm running with you, man. Do your thing.
I've hit the limits of the human bladder, so
we're not going to be too much long. We do have a Super Bowl to do, and we only have an hour allocated. But yes, go do your thing.
No problem.
So Josie, so that's what we're trying to kind of explain, that if you think that's the case. Now, I don't think that it's logically impossible for some metaphysical being to exist. I just don't think that's the case. But there's nothing illogical about it. You would have to show by some kind of like reductio ad absurdum or proof by impossibility that would be the case. And I just don't think there is such a thing for that.
Or my brain may not be capable of understanding.
But that's just an epistemic limit, right? That doesn't mean anything as far as, look, I can like prove that the square root of the square root of 2 is irrational. I can somehow prove that in a logical proof, but not because I understand a little math. But somebody may not be able to understand the math, but they might go, yeah, I agree that it's irrational. I may not fully be able to prove why, but I understand enough to believe that it's the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly, at this time. And then when it comes to God, well, what is it to me if I'm unable to understand? Like, he's got to know that. If my brain is like my daughter's, there's not much. I mean, I can still practice and try and learn things, don't get me wrong, but...
yeah, I'm not following why you don't think that you actually understand, that you don't understand... what is it that the issue is? Because do you know what a metaphysical necessity would be?
Not like, kind of.
Okay, a metaphysical necessity just basically means that it must exist in all possible worlds, right?
Right, but who determines if it must exist? Right, you're just saying it must.
Yeah, well, theists is positing that that's the case, right? They're positing that God is a metaphysical necessity. You don't have to accept that. I don't accept that, but they have every right to do so.
Okay, I don't know what, like, so you're saying is there that there is a metaphysical being that had to start the universe kind of thing?
Yes, yeah. In other words, something that has, all things are contingent upon, right? Because I think most people do recognize that we are contingent beings, right? Again, other than like Cheshire who thinks that the universe revolves around her. You know, we are contingent. There's no metaphysical necessity for us to exist. There is a metaphysical necessity from things like A equals A. Speak of the devil.
You know that I think it revolves around my dog.
That's true. Well, that's clear. Doggos are the.
For what it's worth,
Really.
for what it's worth, Steve, I don't even think I know what metaphysical necessity actually means.
Well, think about it. For example, like the law of identity, right? A equals A. Whatever you instantiate with A, that identity holds true. That's what an identity is. That has to be the case in every possible world. There's no possible world that doesn't hold true.
No, I know what logical necessity is, and I know what nominal necessity.
Okay,
is,
you're just what a metaphysical necessity. Yeah.
Metaphysical necessity I think is problematic and poorly defined.
Have you looked at what's called Kripke called rigid designators?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't buy it.
Yeah,
So,
it's a hard concept. Like H2O being water is a rigid designator, the way Kripke would argue it. I mean, it's hard to say what would be a metaphysical necessity. He would argue that would
have to be a whole.
That's a whole
nother
different. Yeah, that's
episode. There's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, no, I agree with Scott on
sorry,
that.
I
It is very difficult. Yes.
I was advocating that we not get into that, not that we should.
Yeah, I noticed. That's why I figured I'd stop Steve before he started.
We got a super chat.
That's what I'm here for.
It's holding it up.
Real quick, we got a super chat. Atheist linguist for $10 says, I think a lot of the anxiety surrounding the burden of proof is a reaction to so many theists acting as if theism is the default position to be assumed true and unproven false. And that might be the case, atheist linguist.
That's actually what I wanted to swing in and say, is that there's a whole psychology that we might be kind of missing out on here. And it's the psychology of somebody who is coming out of something very, very dogmatic that they may have grown up with, that they've now discovered or they now believe is a lie. And so they've jumped from that and they're very hurt and they're very upset and they're very much interested in launching back out at religion. And because they're so well, I don't know, trained is a good word, but they're so familiar with the tactics that are used in theology and are used by theists that they kind of just carry that dogma and that mentality or those tactics over into their atheism, and they don't kind of like have the time to decompress, particularly on the internet at least.
Oh yeah, I've seen that numerous times with atheists. They seem to have this theistic type mindset that for that very reason, right? They get out of theism and all of a sudden they think they're rational thinkers, and I think they rely a lot on other people's arguments and a lot of things they hear rather than formulating their own, perhaps. But I still see it as the same type of dogmatic by fiat type argumentation. That, like, for example, when I hear atheists say like atheism is the default position, I have yet, and again, I'm willing to actually not die on this hill. If somebody shows me, I'd be happy to read it. But I have yet to find any atheist that has ever shown me anything in philosophy that has a default position for a proposition. I only find it in experimental science and hypothesis. You know, when dealing with various hypotheses. But I've never seen it as what a default position is for a proposition. I don't know what that would actually mean. So, yeah, I just don't think a theist should do that either, actually. You know, because a lot of the presuppositions would do that, right? God exists.
I did have one minor contention with Scott's example, if you don't mind, from earlier. Yay! So you given an example about the conversation, about conversationally versus belief, where you're going to get into a discussion and like whether or not you're going to have that discussion, or whether you just mean like, hey, no, I just mean what I believe. And so I think there's a separation between whether or not you're having this discussion online with people and you've decided to engage, and in which case you would take on that burden because now you are trying to have the conversation, versus if you're just in your house. But on top of that, it was the phrasing you used was, oh, my dad is talking about how God is so great. And you're not going to say, oh, God's not real. But if you say, I'm an atheist, or you say, I don't believe in gods, all of those are saying the same thing.
Well, I don't believe it's not necessarily saying the same thing. But yes, if you say I believe there's no God, you are saying the same thing. You know.
Yeah, I believe gods don't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was trying to illustrate. I was trying to use that as a thought experiment. I mean, it's a real example, but I was trying to use it as a thought experiment to show that it does actually have it's received differently to the human ear. I mean, if this guy says, "Isn't God great?" and I go, "Oh yeah, well, I don't believe in God, but carry on." That's different from him saying, "Isn't God great?" and I go, "There are no gods." I mean
you're talking about
but see, that's
just that's just a discussionary thing though. That's all that is discussionary. Yeah.
But I am actually saying two different things about the world there. I'm not saying the same thing in those two scenarios.
Well, yeah, it sounds to me that you might be taking on the I don't believe in gods and you shouldn't either if you go with the there is no gods.
Kind of, yeah.
Right?
Or like something like, oh, it's something negative about them believing in God.
Well, I think you're saying that they're wrong. Whereas if I just say I don't believe in gods, you're not saying you're wrong. You might say that if I'm right, you would be wrong.
Yeah, you're just saying you're not accepting it.
Yeah, you're just saying that I don't share the same assumptions that you do, and I don't have the same beliefs that you do. So maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should acknowledge that in conversation with me instead of assuming that I have all the same beliefs that you do. That's different from me saying, at least that was my experience with this guy. I was like, I was trying to subtly say to him that like, you don't have to keep assuming I'm a Christian just like you. Like you can acknowledge that it's okay if we have different beliefs here.
Let's talk about that for a second, because do you find, because I certainly do, that a lot of atheists I talk to who say, look, I just don't have a belief either way, which would be the agnostic position that I hold. When you ask them some questions, Scott, almost always, like nearly, I would say vastly the majority of the time, they actually hold the position there are no gods. They just don't want to say it.
Yeah, I think I see that as well.
I mean, admittedly.
What's that?
I just don't have. I'm just saying, admittedly, I almost want to say that. I'm aware of my lack of information on the universe, so I can't say, but I can see why people do that too. And depending on how much someone acknowledges their lack of understanding, yeah, I can see the itch to want.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll hear things like, gods are all BS, but I'm not claiming there are no gods. Yes, you are if you're claiming that they're all BS. I mean, come on, right?
It's like, okay, if it comes down to like, okay, we gotta discuss this because we have to figure this out because my eternity depends on it, or something like a reason, a need. Okay, but if someone's just like, man, in my daily life, as far as I know, nothing's affecting me. There's no God. There's no God talking to me, help me. You know what I mean? So I think it just depends again on the level of necessity at the time, on how you say it.
Yeah, I happen to believe I understand Scott's trying to make a distinction between the psychological state and the claim about ontology. I politely disagree with that as far as I don't think they do the distinction. I think that when you're telling somebody, look, I believe God exists, you are making a claim about what the state of affairs are with the universe. Same thing as I believe there are no gods, right?
Yeah.
I think you are telling them, hey, God doesn't exist or God does exist. I think that's the implication there. I don't see a major difference.
That's something. Yeah, that's something you can like. You are making a claim, sort of. You've not that you have analyzed the universe, but you're saying that in the entire universe there are no gods, as opposed to saying none around me in my bubble of ability to know things.
Yeah, as long as
which is really tiny on it. Sorry.
That's okay.
I mean, the problem with you collapsing that distinction, though, Steve, is that you want to. I mean, on the one hand, you're saying, listen, just because you can admit that you believe there are no gods doesn't mean you have a burden of proof. But on the other hand, you're saying if you're saying that you believe there are no gods, that's indistinguishable from claiming there are no gods. And if that's true, then your first claim is not true. That if it's true that by saying I believe there are no gods, I am in fact saying there are no gods, then actually I do have a burden of proof.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think they're very similar. I mean, you're affirming the propositional content by saying I believe it is the case that there are gods, and if that's the case, you are telling the person, you're telling the theist, hey, look, there are no gods. You're incorrect. Your belief is wrong.
Right, and that's but you're now validating the very fear that causes people to take the Lacktheist position.
No, I get that, but you know what? Maybe they need to get over that fear,
Seems
right?
like good, be afraid.
Yeah, maybe they need to get over that fear. It's an irrational fear.
There's two different things, though. I think that you're both correct, but I think you're both correct for different reasons. Steve is right from like the ontological point of view, but Scott is right when it comes to conversation. If you're having the conversation and if you're talking, when you say, hey, I don't believe in God or there are no gods, you are trying to communicate something differently.
Right.
Or something different from the other. Those are two different.
Yeah, I totally agree with Scott on the difference between the psychological assessment and the ontological claim. I do agree those are different. But I do think that when you're saying, I believe it is the case, you are making an ontological claim, even though they are different. I think there's an implication. I hate to say the word entailment, but I think there's an implication.
You're not necessarily trying to have the discussion, though.
True. And it is discursory, right? I mean, if I'm not having the discussion with somebody, then yes, I really have no onus to give any reason.
What's interesting to me, though, Steve, is that you made a distinction between which is a distinction I don't see, which is that you said the claim there is no God does not imply I know there is no God.
Right.
And that's interesting because what is saying I know there is no God means? Well, knowledge is justified true belief, at least, right?
Sure.
So that means to say I know there is no God,
that implies you believe it.
Say it implies that I believe it. It implies that my belief is justified.
Yes.
And it implies that it's true.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
But if I just say there is no God, well, that surely fits the true criteria, right? If I'm claiming there is no God, I'm saying it is true that there is no God. The only criteria left to meet are that I believe it, which I do, clearly, and that my belief in it is justified.
But just saying that...
And if you're saying...
so you're arguing... Okay, real quick. So you're arguing that because you're saying that, you're saying that somebody is saying that they believe it, it's true, and that they're justified because they're saying it.
If you're going to say there is no God, not I believe there is no God, because if you're saying I believe there is no God, you're not necessarily saying that your belief is justified or that it ends up being true. You're just claiming that you have this belief that there is no God. But if you're saying there is no God, period, what's implicit in that is that it's true, that you believe it, and the only thing missing is that your belief in it is justified, which would be a huge stress to say there is no God, but that claim is not justified. Why would you claim there is no God if you believe that the claim there is no God is not justified, right? So I don't think you can say there is no God in a way that doesn't imply I know there is no God. It fits all three criteria.
I think a lot of it comes down to the determination of the truth of the proposition, right? There's a lot of things that we would have to, then you have to go into, okay, what makes the proposition true? Is there a truth maker to be had there? Is there a truth condition to be had there? I understand what your argument is, I really do. But I think that we're just making a Dostoevsky claim.
Every time I end up on camera with Scott, I'm in my damn pajamas. So there's the
don't stand up. Is that the takeaway here? Don't stand up.
I think that there's a little bit of a the thing is you run into these differences in communication, and you run into differences between have you justified something to yourself? I think it should be encouraged, if you hold a position, that you should justify that position to at least yourself, and different people are going to have different levels of justification. So what might be justified to me might not be justified to Steve. Or
that you haven't demonstrated that it's true. Again, knowledge requires that a proposition is true, not that we just believe it to be true, right?
Sure. So the best example I can think of this is probably somebody who is somebody who's experienced God, somebody who's had an epiphany, somebody who's had some kind of like Jesus experience. Well, that might be convincing to them, but you're going to have a hard time utilizing that to convince somebody else. So their personal belief in a God or lack of a God could be met. That burden of proof, that justification could be there, but that justification doesn't necessarily translate into other people, which changes what you mean by the burden of proof if you're talking about personal versus trying to convince.
Yeah, others. I call it non-transportable justifications. That's what I
Well,
call it.
that's the difference between knowledge and arguments, right? I mean, this is even something that William Lane Craig says. You know, it's one thing for me to say that I know God exists and my belief in the Holy Spirit is justified. It's an entirely different thing for me to prove it to you, right? Now, I would argue that his belief is not in fact justified based on his reports of what he thinks is justifying those beliefs. But yeah, so burden of proof is about persuasion, and knowledge claims are just about whether or not you are in fact justified even within the privacy of your own head.
Yeah, I don't
feel like
think
there's a
it
bit
has
of
to
a
be just
problem though with
persuasion.
people who they haven't met their personal justification, or they're picky about what their justification utilizes. So that's when you get into special pleading. That's when you get into somebody who says like, hey, listen, it's okay for my God to do this, but it's not okay for your God to do this, or whatever, what have you in that case.
So
Sure,
I know we don't have too much time left. Scott, what do you think the virtues are for atheists to adopt the usage of atheism as moral belief? Why do you think that would be better for atheism? Because I think that I am convinced that the reason why a lot of these groups want to just water it down and say, look, atheism is anybody who lacks a belief, is for political reasons. I believe it's for demographics. I think you know, David Silverman and Five in God make that he argues that. I know genetically modified skeptic argues that. And I think there's some utility arguments for that. I can counter those arguments.
I think cosmic skepticism is going that direction too.
Slightly, I think so. I tried reaching out the other day, but yeah. But I still think overall, I think that's very short term, and I think that in the long run, they're defeating their own cause. I think they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot because I don't know why they would not want if they think theism is false, and I think that most of them do. Why would they not want people to take a stronger position on it, right? Why do they not want to say, look, we want atheism to be a belief that God doesn't exist, and we want to explain to you why there are no gods? Because that's what they kind of do.
Like, wouldn't you assume more than just lack of belief in God? Wouldn't there be more to it?
Yeah, but what's the big deal about that, right?
Yes, that would be the point.
That's the point, right? I mean, if you're trying to change the world and get, like I'm a secularist, right? I do believe that we should have separation of church and state. I don't want creationism taught in schools,
You
right?
suggesting that argument is like why would you want to use a wet noodle?
I mean, it just seems
with a little bit more integrity.
Yeah, it just seems counterproductive. If my goal, right? If Scott, like for example, if my goal is to get religion out of school, right? Especially creationism, we both agree young earth creationism is nonsense, right? If that's my goal, why would I not want less theists in the world that hold that position, right? I mean, that doesn't mean all theism is bad, or not. You don't have to be anti-theist or anything like that. But you're saying
it's almost nothing to do with God, yeah.
Right, but if you're telling people, look, let me tell you why your God doesn't exist, isn't that better in the long run if that's the end result for a utility argument?
Yeah, but not everybody wants to have to make a case. You know, they just want to be able to. I mean, there are two cultures here. There's one culture that wants to win a war of ideas and ultimately eliminate, you know, bad ideas, and they count religion among those ideas, or religious, you know, the set of propositions that we would call this religion or that religion, right? That's one project. There's another project, which is an entirely different community with an entirely different philosophy that also identify as atheists or non-believers or what have you. And their project is it's more along secularist lines, where they just want to be left alone. They just want to stop being proselytized to. They want you know, religion to stop being imposed on them, and that's why they're taking the position that, look, I'm not buying what you're selling. That's all.
But why are they enforcing that on other people though?
What's wrong with that?
Because I like literally today I had somebody tell me, look, you have to be an atheist or theist. They're prescriptively telling me something that I know not to be the case, right? I know that they're incorrect according to philosophical understandings. That is something that is objectively the case.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive for both people in that case, because trying to impose people into your box to increase your numbers isn't helpful. Because they're just falsifying your numbers when you don't have to fit them into your box to get them to agree with you. You don't need to force an agnostic into an atheist box for the atheist or for the agnostic to not want like prayer in school.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, I only explain these terms. I don't go around saying you must use them.
Right.
But
and on the other hand, it's not beneficial, and it's counterintuitive for atheists to go around saying you have to describe this way or you're wrong, when they just want to be left alone. So if you want to be left alone, don't do the thing that people are bothering you, that are doing. They're
Right.
doing the same thing. So it's counterintuitive. In
Yeah,
both
because
ways.
again, when somebody tells me that I must be one or the other, I know that they're incorrect, and they're prescriptively doing exactly what they accuse other people of doing. And I find that to be, again, counterproductive to people that want to learn about these things. I think it's harmful if they want to be considered to be honest interlocutors when they prescriptively say things like that. It makes no sense to me.
But this is
I think
what's weird
it's
about
trying
this
to-
to me.
Hang on, go ahead, Scott. What?
It's not that they're, I mean, you're saying like when someone is telling me I have to be atheist or theist and I know they're wrong, it's not that they're wrong, it's that they're clearly using the word atheist as a negation and you're not, right? And if atheist means not theist, then it is the logical
Well,
negation.
no, actually, that's not true. It's not
and it's
that's
true.
No, the logical negation would be God does not exist. Right? You're not negating
No.
the predicate. You're negating the proposition. If
those
it's not
terms.
right, well,
I think it's more of the concept.
the
I
A-
understand what we're kind of
the A is the
talking
Greek
about.
alpha privative, which basically is negation of the proposition. So if the proposition is God is true, the negation is God exists, and the negation is God does not exist, right? And they're wrong in the sense that if there is usages out there where you don't have to be one or the other.
Yeah, but you're sort of smuggling in your definition into their definition.
The
There's two
reason
different ways
why,
of thinking about it.
the reason why though is because if you use the other definition, the logic, like the logic, philosophical logic that Steve is using to balance the equation, because it's an equation. You can write it down like this is like the same.
The McRae-Knoll Venn diagram. There you go.
Sure, yeah. The same way you would do algebra and you can balance an equation to figure out what A is it's the same thing that Steve is doing. But if you impose the other definition, so if you were to take this definition out and plug the other definition in, it doesn't work. That's why Steve is using the other definition, because if you use this one, it doesn't work. And one of the problems I think me and Steve run into a lot of the time, particularly Steve, because he's the one who does this, I don't do this as much, is that the people who are using this definition to impose on other people atheism will not accept the logical problems that come with it. Now, it's one thing if they want to use this definition, that's fine, but there are problems that are arisen when you use it, and they're not only
Like
are
my
they
WASP
unwilling
argument.
to right, like
Which
the
is
WASP argument.
Okay, so give me an example of one of these problems, just so I'm up to speed.
The WASP argument is the WASP is the weak atheist special pleading argument that is still unassailed. But basically, it goes along the lines of if an atheist wants to use the term atheism to represent lack of belief that God exists, then they must allow a theist to use theism as the word for lacking a belief that God does not exist. Else, that will be special pleading.
I'm not sure how that.
okay,
Well, I mean,
I
I'm
think
not sympathetic to that view, but I don't see how that follows.
Okay, so let's say.
Are you referring to the fact that like we're trying to get people trying to get theists to make it more than beliefs, try and prove it, but like atheists are bringing it about belief themselves?
Can you say that
Or am I
again?
misunderstanding?
I don't think we heard that.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you mean like because theism implies they believe, then atheists are saying we don't believe, so we're putting belief in there as well. Is that where you're going? Sorry.
Well, if an atheist wants to say, "Look, I merely lack a belief that God exists, therefore that I'm an atheist," then a theist can say, "I merely lack a belief that God does not exist, therefore I'm a theist." And so anybody who merely lacks a belief that they don't accept the proposition that God does not exist is therefore a theist.
But it wouldn't be that. It would be, the conversation would go differently. I mean, if both parties are being, kind of rigorous here, you'd have the theist going, okay, so all atheist tells me is this one thing that you don't believe, right? All the word atheist means is that you're just not a theist, right? Okay, so what is the word for somebody who has the positive belief that no God exists? And then the atheist would say, okay, well, we'll call that an anti-theist, or they can make up whatever fucking word they want, naturalist, or whatever.
There are people that do that, by the way. That's not what atheism is.
No,
or
but that's
naturalism,
fine.
I've seen
but
that.
Then,
yes.
okay, so then they say, well, naturalist isn't quite right because it's all supernatural things. But let's say they go, I'm an atheist, but a naturalist is somebody who has the positive belief that there are no gods, right? And so I prefer you to use the word naturalist. Then the theist gets to come back and go, okay, I'm an anaturalist. right? You're an atheist and I'm an a
Well,
naturalist.
okay, but
That's the symmetry you're looking for.
no, there's not.
The way
I know,
you were
there's
saying
not.
it
There's not a
doesn't work.
symmetry there. So let me explain why. If okay, let's call it the weak, so it's easier to understand, the weak case condition, right? So if the weak case is merely not believing, right? If the weak case for atheism is going to be normative for
The absence of
the
belief.
absence of belief is going to be normative for atheism, then the absence of belief has to be normative for theism as well. But the absence of belief is merely the absence of belief of the negation. That's
I'm
it.
not sure. I don't follow that inference. If atheism has to be defined this way, then theism has to be defined.
No,
the
not
same way.
has to. No, I'm not saying there's logical
Go back
entailment there.
here.
I want to make that very clear. They don't have to. The argument for the WASP is that you have to allow them to do so. Oh, it's a special pleading. That's it. You have to allow
Well, no,
them
but
to
they,
do so.
but they can, but it wouldn't be. But the symmetry there would
It's
not
perfectly.
be.
The symmetry's
I'm
perfect.
an atheist. It would be
No.
I'm an a naturalist.
No, it has nothing to do with naturalism.
No,
I can,
the reason why it wouldn't
what,
be.
well, I can show that the symmetry exists in the Venn diagram that I have out there. I mean, that's.
Okay, so
Pull it up.
okay, if you're actually going to
I gotta
define
find it.
atheism, well, okay, so if we define atheism as an absence of belief in God, right? So then you're saying you would define theism as the absence of a belief in God?
No, merely that.
That's a double negative.
No,
That's just
no,
dramatic.
merely that theism
Yeah.
is the absence of belief that God doesn't exist. That's all. That's it. There's no
One
double
of the other
negative there.
side problems that we run into just before we jump onto this is I've seen people do this a few times, trying to utilize the English language to impose things onto philosophy, and the jargon within philosophy does not work. Just don't do it.
Well,
Sorry,
there's no
please
double
continue.
negative there. To say I do not believe God does not exist, it's not a double negative. One negative is on the predicate, one negative is on the proposition. That's not a double negative. A double negative would be
English barely applies its rules to itself.
I do not believe God exists, or not.
So we're not
P.
using grammar?
No,
Just
it
making
is
sure.
grammar. No, the grammar's fine. I mean, it's not a double negative. Just say I do not believe, not P is not a double negative. That's it. There's no double
Right,
negative there,
I
I'll
was
show you.
referring to what you said a few minutes ago about if atheism is not believing, then theism is not believing. Sorry, I forget how you said that.
If atheism is the lack of belief that God exists, then a theist could say that theism is the lack of belief that God does not exist. It's just in the negation. It's a perfect symmetry there.
Yeah, see, that just sounds like it's grammatically
It's not. It's perfectly grammatically fine.
redundant. Yeah, no, not that it doesn't work. It's
Let me throw up the Venn. You know Landon, right, Scott? You know Landon pretty well, right? I think.
Henrik?
No. Landon Kurt Knoll.
No.
I know you. I think you've seen him. I don't know if you've been on stream with him. He's a mathematician.
Oh, cool.
He has 8 mathematical world records. He's a computer scientist, volcanologist. He's a genius. But he and I
He
came.
got chased by
What
pirates
is he doing
once.
hanging around with us?
I know, right? He's like literally the smartest guy on the planet, I think, in my opinion, or at least as far as I've ever met. But we do a show together called Definitely One Science. But let me transition here to what is called the McRae-Knoll Venn diagram. This, and I'll send it to you in DM too, so you can look it over later, and the WASP argument in full, and you can ponder it. But this actually is a mathematical relationship that shows there is a perfect symmetry there.
No, I read your article about that, and I take that point, but I think we're making different points. The only point that I'm making was that if we adopt the semantics that Lacktheists are pitching, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we adopt those semantics and we say, okay, atheism is literally just the absence of a belief in God, then they are correct when they say everyone is either a theist or
I
an
agree
atheist.
with you. But here's the thing. This is why they need to
okay.
say, look, the way we use these words, you are either an atheist or theist. I have no issue with that. That would be fine. That would be a qualifier. But they don't say that. If you and I've been doing this a very long time, and I think that Cheshire could back me up in this. If you do listen to Matt Dillahunty or listen to Aaron Raw, they don't say that. They say this is it. There is no other way. There's no possibility of any kind under any usages that you are neither. And now I think Matt has changed his a little bit, but Aaron says that.
The problem that we run into isn't that people can't use these definitions. People can't use the word this way. They're more than welcome to. However, if you're going to enter these discussions, particularly if you're going to start talking to people about philosophy, you need to understand that if you're going to use these terms, you're taking on the burden of the problems that come with these terms.
Yeah.
So things, that's how you end up with rocks are atheists.
Scott's no longer a rock atheist, right?
Okay, that's just nonsense to say.
But on top of that, you also run into this issue where you've got people running around telling Steve that he's wrong philosophically when he's not.
Right.
And the reason you have stuff like that is because you have people who are in the positions that are quote unquote leading, that are saying that somebody who calls in and talks to them about philosophy, instead of saying, hey, no, we're not talking about that, we're using this definition, or we're talking about this in particular, they say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that person wasn't wrong.
I know we got to wrap this up. So, Scott, let me ask you this. As somebody who you appreciate philosophy, and I have the utmost respect for you for that. When I have a discussion about philosophy with somebody who is a philosopher, right, and we have discussions with many experts in philosophy, and we're having a dialogue about it, right, and we're on the same page, we're using the same vernacular that we use for reading a paper, and I have an atheist come in and they say, look, you guys are using these words wrong. You're flat out wrong. I have a guy named Randolph Richardson, who's the head of the Atheist International Alliance in Canada. He's writing SEP because he thinks Paul Draper is wrong. That's the arrogance he has when he doesn't know anything about logic. He doesn't know anything about epistemology. He is literally personified Dunning-Kruger. How do you respond to those types of atheists who keep telling me that in the schema that I'm using for philosophy that I'm wrong? Because I think you would agree that my schema isn't incorrect. It is how it actually is understood in philosophy. If somebody wants to use something different, hey, they can do that. But if I'm having a discussion with a philosopher and we're using the same vernacular and they tell me that's wrong, that's where I say, look, this is where we have the problem here.
Guess how I would respond to somebody saying that to me.
You tell them to fuck off, but yeah.
No.
If
If I'm having a conversation with somebody else who's philosophically literate, and we're both using atheist to mean the belief that no gods exist, and then some third party comes into the conversation and says, no, that's not what atheist means. This is the real definition of atheist. I look at the other philosopher, we give each other a little wink, and then we both go, okay, we're changing the definition now and we're going to use it your way.
And that's fine if you want to do that. Absolutely. But what happens if they don't want to? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but
they should.
Steve, he said
if I'm okay, forget the other philosopher in the room. I'm as if I'm a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher.
You're philosophizing.
If I'm talking philosophy with somebody and then I use the word atheist and they say that's not what atheist means, and atheist is a lack of belief in God, I go, okay, that's okay, then that's what I'm going to mean by the word atheist, and give me another word to use for the belief that there are no gods. And they go strong atheist or anti-theist or naturalist, and I go, okay, that's the word I'm going to use. I don't give a shit. I
agree with you, but that's discussionary, right? Those are discursive type things.
I think Steve runs into the problem a little bit in a different way, because Steve is trying to have the conversation that's like a little bit like a step further than that, so he gets caught up in these semantics, because now he's trying to talk about the philosophy and the ideology and etc of atheism versus agnosticism, because people are telling him, like, this third party isn't saying,
they're saying I'm an atheist, but I'm not an atheist. It's very disconcerting. It's very dishonest.
It's a weird dynamic.
Yeah, well, listen, there's a conversation to be had about, and this works with moral language as well, but there's a conversation to be had about, okay, what is the best way to define this that's going to create the least amount of confusion and that's going to help us communicate ideas the most clearly and succinctly? I argue that if we define atheism this way and agnosticism this way, it's just cleaner, it's simpler, it requires fewer.
We're on the same page there, man. Absolutely.
And then somebody else goes, no, actually, I think it's cleaner to just create this dichotomy of theist and atheist, because then you only have two options. There's nothing in the middle, and that's good, and I go, okay, yeah, I know that seems cleaner, but you can have that conversation.
I agree with that 1,000%. Yes.
But unless that's the conversation unless you're trying to have a conversation about what the best and most useful semantics are, then you should just fucking let it go. Otherwise, I mean, because it's just gonna get in the way of the substance of the conversation.
You will lose your mind how often we get told that we're having a semantic argument.
And it's funny,
but I'll
a lot of times it's
I'll
not.
never
It's
let
actually.
myself lose my mind over shit like that.
I don't.
though.
I don't.
You just
I don't understand why they don't. A lot of people don't understand the difference between a semantic argument and a logical one. My WASP argument, and I'm sorry, is not a semantic argument. It is a logical argument. It is if then else. It involves semantics. I would be okay if somebody said it's meta semantical maybe, but it's not an argument about how words should be used. It's not a word about their meanings. It is if this, then this, else that. That's strictly logical.
No, it's a semantic argument with a reductio ad absurdum. It's an argument about.
It's not showing anything false. It's not showing a
conclusion.
It's not showing a contradiction, right? What it's showing is that there's a special pleading to be a fallacy out there for atheists that are doing this if they don't allow theists to do the exact same thing. That's all. And the way a simpler way would do it is if weak atheism equals theism, then weak theism equals theism. Or you can't have that. You have to allow that at least. That's it. A very simple approach. But a lot of people balk at that, going, "Well, you can't do that." Well, why not? If you're allowing an atheist to go, "Look, I'm just going to say that atheism is anybody who doesn't believe God exists," then an atheist has every right to say, "Look, a theist is somebody who doesn't believe that God does not exist." You have to allow them that opportunity. There's no way out of that I've ever seen.
But I think that you'd be surprised at the number of Lacktheists who would be happy to grant that.
Never one. I've not met one yet, to be honest with you.
I just did.
And
okay, well, she might be the first. So you're okay with?
I think it might be a little bit different if you accept it during this conversation versus if you accept it while you're debating or arguing with a theist, who then just turns around and says, "Well, I just lack this, so I don't have to prove anything to you."
Yeah,
because that's
and now you're a theist, right?
There's more.
Yes.
There's more to the conversation, but you can just say that. Sure, go ahead.
Well, that's the problem, though, right? That's one of the problems you run into when you use this lack of belief distinction. When you use this definition, is that you've ended the conversation. If you're demanding that theists have to show their proof, they have the burden of proof if they're going to preach or they're going to say that God exists, and then you say, "Well, yeah, but I don't have to prove anything," you've shut the conversation down. If you don't have to justify them, why should they have to justify?
See, I think that atheists can say there's no God and shut the conversation down, but they can also say, "Why do you believe in a God? Tell me about it. Sure, let's talk." And that's not.
And that's fine, but I'm fascinated by why
the conversation down. I think that opens it up entirely because now you can tell somebody why you don't believe in those
exactly.
gods.
I want to know why somebody believes there are no gods or doesn't believe. I'm fascinated by that just as much as I am a theist who believes, right? And I think a lot of people shut down the conversation, and we'll kind of leave it at that and wrap it up. Is that when I see atheists go, "Look, the theist has the only burden of proof. I don't have to explain anything. I don't have to justify my belief or my lack of belief," and I'm like, that's absurd. That is just. That is a dishonest marketer.
I think I'm responsible to ask the questions that I don't understand, because nobody else can answer those, or even be aware that I don't understand if I don't ask them. So I wouldn't say so much burden of proof, but yeah, I could definitely ask, "What are you talking about?"
Oh, sure.
Show me.
But I don't think you need to go back to step one every single time. Again, if you just say, "Look," and again, you get into polytheism and all this other stuff, but if you just want to have a basic conversation, because all I care a damn about is, do you think there's an intelligent agent that exists, that without whose existence there would be no universe? That's all I want to know. If you believe that's true or false. Josie, what do you think? Is that true or false?
I don't know if it's true or false.
Okay, so you're agnostic on that. You would consider, so philosophically speaking, you're agnostic on the proposition if there's any gods.
I'm pretty sure I always get the agnostic definitions backwards, but yeah, I don't have enough information to verify.
Okay, and that's why I think, and we'll leave it at that. That I think there's a great utility, and Scott pointed this out astutely, that by having these types of different terminologies, it's much cleaner because I don't have the same position as Scott. Why would we want to have the same label? Because it doesn't describe us properly. If I tell Cheshire, "Hey, look, I'm an atheist and Scott's an atheist, but he has a very different position than me," are we really communicating her the same thing? Of course not. It makes very little sense to me to have such a word that describes vastly different positions, right?
Well, even your definition doesn't
we...
capture the difference between our beliefs.
Well, it sure does. Agnostic captures the position that I have suspended judgment. Agnostic captures the position that they formed a conclusion.
No. But you gave you and me as an example. We both have the belief that there are no gods.
No, I don't. I'm not. No, I don't. I'm agnostic. I'm not an atheist.
Yeah. So you're so okay, got it. You're
yeah. So
not
that,
no
dude,
wonder you
I'm
have
the
such a
atheist.
dog in this fight.
Right.
You might be called an atheist.
Dude, I am the a-holy Pope of agnosticism. Where have you been? Remember the a-holy Pope?
I didn't know. I didn't know. I thought you were saying, listen, I'm brave enough to say there are no gods.
But I'm happy to
stack up.
But I'm happy.
That's me.
But
I'm that
that's
one.
Cheshire.
Oh, you're that
but
one.
I'm
Okay,
happy
got
to
it.
help out the atheists like that. My whole thing has been from day one. I really trying to help the atheist. I didn't give a damn about the theist. I was helping the atheists have better argumentation, and they shat on me for it, man.
I did an interview. I should move. I did an interview with Tim O'Neill, who is like an amateur historian, and he gets called a Christian pretending to be an atheist because his arguments are ones that Christians would use or can use against atheists, because he says people are factually wrong about history, and he gets shit on for it.
I had to mute you a little bit. There's a lot of background noise, but anyways, Josie, thanks for the call. We only had time for one call. I don't want to take too much Scott's time up. I'm sure we can probably do this again another time when he has more time. But
I'll also
this was
get out
fun.
your voice to wrap up. Bye.
All right, so thank you
Bye,
guys. So let's kind of wrap this up, Scott. I appreciate you coming in, and I enjoy these conversations with you, man.
Yeah, me too.
A lot. And I'm not just trying to stroke you. I do think as a layperson, you have one of the best grasps on the ability to understand philosophy. And look, I'm a layperson too, so we're you and I in the exact same position there. But the thing is that there are a lot of people that aren't lay people that listen to both of us. And that are intrigued by what we have to say. And I'm honored by that, and I'm sure you are as well. Your videos for theoretical bullshit, I've watched years ago, and I still watch, and I'm awe-inspired by them.
Thank you.
I still think your argument on Kalam is one of the best I've seen. I know we differ on the premise. I'd say premise one is the problem. Although I have a problem with premise
I do
two
too.
as
No,
much.
that's the one I have the problem with, is premise one.
Well, I thought you went to premise two that you thought was probably the bigger issue.
No, I'm lamenting that there's so much focus on premise two, and premise one gets taken for granted by both sides.
Okay, so we're on the same page on that. Okay, cool.
Oh yeah,
See?
yeah.
Awesome. But if anybody wants to check out your channel, Theoretical Bullshit, the link is in the video description. And yeah, if you here's the thing, we all have our niche, right? My niche, I'm gonna brag a little bit. I think as a whole, agnosticism, atheism, the logic, and the epistemology, that's kind of what I have a passion for, because I enjoy it. Your niche is you know the Kalam better than anybody, I think. So because that's your thing. You really, for some reason, love the Kalam. And so if people want to like learn about that, here's your go-to guy right there. But what do you got to leave us some parting words, and we'll kind of close this out and call it a day.
Sure,
Super Bowl.
You have no more callers, right? I'm happy to hang around for 5-10 more minutes if somebody's trying to get in.
All right, well, we'll try for one more. The call number is on the video description. It's on the layout here. Again, I'm trying new things. Actually, I don't know if I should put this out there yet. Should I? You guys want to know a secret? You like secrets? Yeah. All right. Chester and I are working on something new. We do Caffeine Corner every Monday. We moved it from 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and it has been awesome. I mean, Caffeine Corner is us explaining to people critical thinking things and talking about all kinds of stuff. But we want to do a call-in show like this. And so we're developing something new because I don't think we're gonna. Let's be honest. I don't think I'm gonna get the non sequitur show back. It's had its day. Right now, I just want to see Kyle in prison, and I just want to see him owe me like $100,000. That's fine. I can live with this. Cheshire wants the channel back. Whatever. But we're gonna move on, and we're gonna be doing some other stuff. So we've got something in the works, and this is kind of a test for that in some ways. Although I will be doing Steve's Sunday School on Sundays, but occasionally I want to do something like this where I just bring a guest on. And we have a conversation to show that people can have these types of conversations. They are possible.
That's great, man. That's really cool.
But I can't believe nobody wants to call in. Anybody want to call in?
Oh, no. If there's no more callers, then screw it. We can wrap up.
Well, we'll give it 30 seconds here. There is a slight delay. But what other arguments are you getting into lately other than your Kalam?
I've gone a few rounds on. I'm becoming really interested in this argument from moral knowledge, which I like, which is better than the traditional, moral argument. The old school, so the William Lane Craigian moral argument is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And I think that's just a
S.J.
it's just a
Thomas's
bad
go-to argument.
for
Yeah.
so many different reasons.
One of my least
But
favorite arguments. I think the moral argument
yeah,
sucks.
I mean, there's a lot you can. It's fun to play with it. You can have a lot of fun with it in conversation. It makes for great conversation, but it's just not a compelling argument for various reasons. It's not going to convince anybody of anything.
Yeah, you can actually frame it in the negation as well, and show that God doesn't exist. So I don't see a compelling argument either. Plus,
yeah, you'd have to argue for that. You'd have
right, absolutely.
That premise is true, but then the argument for that premise would also include premises that the other side isn't going to buy. And this goes back to Oppie's whole point about how, a lot of the time arguments are just talking past each other. But there is an argument, an updated sort of moral argument by this guy, Dustin Crummett, or maybe it's Crumet. And I just had a really great conversation with it. He's a philosopher. And I just had a good conversation with him on the capturing
Christianity,
inspiring Christianity.
Oh, inspiring Christianity. I know both.
Salem. Yeah. He's a nice guy. And yeah, so this moral argument it's different. It's an argument from moral knowledge, and so it takes a bit of a different approach. It's not saying
more epistemology.
So it's conceding that, okay, we're not saying that morality is grounded in God, or that God's nature or commands are what makes something right or wrong. We can totally stipulate that things are right or wrong intrinsically, and that God may not be needed to ground moral facts, but you do need God to account for the fact that we have moral knowledge. Why do we have intuitions about what's right and what's wrong? Why are those intuitions true? How can we get morality right if there is no God, if we evolved? It's sort of like a Plantingan.
Yeah, it's more epistemology more than moral ontology.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and I had a lot of fun talking with him about that, and I don't know, maybe
I love that
maybe
too.
If I get a wild hair up my ass, I'll make a video about it or something, because I like it. I respect the argument.
Yeah, no, and I love that topic, by the way. But do you think, for example, like I hear a lot of times atheists throw this out there by fiat. Morals must be subjective. There's no such thing as objective morality. And I cringe at that, because look, I tend to moral realism, although I think it's fascinating to have what's called error theory, if you ever looked at Mackey's error theory, which is very interesting. But I have no problem with objective morals. I just don't believe at all that they have to be based upon a God. As a matter of fact, I find that to be counterintuitive, because if there's a God and there's divine command theory, that to me falls under ethical subjectivism.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so
right.
I mean,
so that's why this new argument circumvents that and says, oh, no, we're not saying that you need God to ground or account for the fact that there are objective morals, but you do need God to account for the fact that we have any knowledge of these morality.
That's a good video for you to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I like the argument. I liked the conversation I had with the author of that argument about the argument. And it's worth exploring.
Yeah, because I accept there's moral facts, and I accept that they could be objective. I will agree with Matt Dillahunty on this. I know there's some bad blood there, although I have nothing against the guy. I really don't. I don't care.
Me? I don't.
No,
I don't have bad blood.
I don't. No, I know you get along. Yeah, you get along with Matt fine. I really don't have anything against the guy, except that he just kind of shits on me for no reason. But I have to agree with him on what I think he's right about, right? I don't just disagree with people for the sake of argument. He is correct when he argues that you can have an objective moral framework once you guys decide on the axioms, right? You're grounding.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that's kind of my thing about it is you have to know what it is you mean. What are you actually describing about a given behavior or choice by calling it right or wrong? What are you actually saying is true about it when you call it right or wrong? And for me, clearly I don't know what you're talking about if what you're saying about it isn't something to do with well-being and suffering.
I grounded in that too. The Sam Harris approach.
Experiences. Yeah. Although Sam Harris, the difference there is that Sam Harris believes that the is-ought gap is illusory, and I don't. I think it's worth embracing, and I don't think you can have moral obligations that aren't in some way contingent on a shared goal or desired outcome.
Okay, so I do think grounding in eudaimonia is fine, harms and benefits, and I do think that there is an is-ought problem. I don't find a strong way to get an ought from an is. However, some have argued that Hume had actually shown a way to do it, but I don't think he realized it at the time. But I think when we're talking about our moral duties and obligations, what we're saying is what is morally permissible and what is forbidden, right? Deontologically speaking. And so what we want to know is what is the moral thing to do? What is the right course of action? And I love the fact that you were able to distinguish between moral ontology and moral epistemology, because what is right or wrong and how we know that are vastly different topics.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just seem to forget that distinction. Super chat for My Unfinished Journey, $5. Late check-in. Dig your stuff, Scott.
Thanks.
Yeah,
that was it? You paid $5 for that?
Yeah. Make a bank here, baby. Do you still realize how much influence you have because of your videos?
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing how some of them people still find relevant, which a lot of them I don't find relevant.
Some of them are a little antiquated, but I mean, you've done them for those are like 6 years old. When's the last time you had an updated video? You did one a few months ago, didn't you?
Yeah, I did one on Plantinga's modal ontological argument, which
what do you think about
not super accessible?
Well, do you okay, I don't want to get too much into, I don't want to go too much longer, but do you accept the axiom, I think it's S5 axiom for the logical necessity on his premise?
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
That's not the part of the argument that I think is problematic. I think the idea of a metaphysically necessary being is impossible. And that's the problem with the argument.
Gotcha.
Although, even like somebody like Josh Rasmussen,
he's awesome. Josh is awesome.
Christian philosopher, super cool guy, really thoughtful, really humble, really intelligent. But he doesn't like my objection to the ontological argument, but he thinks that there is a good objection to the ontological argument, which is I think it's Oppie's, maybe, which is just to do it in reverse. I mean, all you need to do is change the first premise of the whole argument to it is possible that God does not exist. Yes. And then everything else.
Premise one is what I was attacking.
That God does not exist.
I agree with you 100%. S5, I'm fine with the axiom. Taking that axiom that whatever's logically necessary must be logically possible in all possible worlds. That's what the whole thing kind of contingents upon for that logical axiom. But I would deal with premise one. Right.
I do too. I just don't think I reject the idea that a necessary being is possible, which means the premise one is false.
Yeah, no, I don't have a problem with that approach. The only problem I have with the approach that many atheists take is when I hear them say Plantinga's modal ontological argument merely defines God into existence. That's not what he's doing.
It's not what he intends to do, but I think in fact, as a matter of fact,
you might argue that that's the ramification. That's the end result. But
at the end of the day, well, this is what I argued in my video is that there's Saint Anselm's ontological argument, arguably did try to define God into existence.
Yeah, the original version of the
greatest conceivable being,
maximum great being,
greater to exist in reality than in the mind. Right. You're just defining God into existence, right? Plantinga comes along and says, listen, God has this property. The property is not of
great making property. Yeah.
Right. It's great making property, but the property we're in question here is not. We're not saying that God has the property of existence. We're granting Kant's argument that existence can't be a property of something, but instead we have this more modest property, which is a great making property called necessary existence. And the difference there is that necessary existence is saying instead of God has the property of existence, therefore God exists, we're saying if God exists, his existence is necessary. That doesn't mean God exists.
No,
if God exists, his existence
I'm on board with that.
So you're not defining him into existence. The problem with that is that if you pop the hood and look under it, look in the engine, you find that the property of necessary existence ends up reducing to the property of existence, and then Kant's criticism applies all over again. Yeah, and I make a whole argument for that in the video, and I don't have to do it here. But that's
well, Cy, I get along with Cy, right? Cy Tempernicate. I don't know why. We have diametrically different views. Okay, this is again. I like the conversation. I think that people have diametrically different views that can actually have a conversation is amazing. I'm all about the conversation. I happen to get along with Cy. He's actually, you get him off script, he's actually a decent dude.
If you get him off
script, but. I asked them that kind of questions. I'm like, if God exists and he would be a metaphysical necessity, I'm okay with granting that. But what I don't grant is that he has to exist as a metaphysical necessity. What is there about that says he has to exist. I don't grant that. I will grant, even arguendo, that if there is a God with all those great making properties, then sure, I would be fine with people saying he would be a metaphysical necessity. But he didn't have an explanation for that. I was like, well, what makes it the case that he has to be a metaphysical necessity?
Yeah, I don't even think, I think that even if we suppose we start with the assumption that God exists, I don't think God would be or could possibly be metaphysical.
You think it's just impossible to begin with?
Yeah. Well, I think that property is not a real property.
Okay.
It can't be a real property of anything because it leads to absurdities, as I try to show in that video. What does Sai say when you say you can't buy that God exists as the God's
he's
existence?
like, well, he goes back on script. Well, how do you know anything? Kind of thing.
That's
that's kind of his go fallback. But yeah, he has admitted to me before that my arguments aren't bad. I mean, he knows that he can't do the script to me. Like, come on, if you and Sai had a conversation, you would get him off script in seconds, and he would just try to be changing it to something completely.
Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how focused I am and how But presuppositionalism is successful, for a reason, and it's that the script has been developed extensely.
Not
over
as much
time.
as it used to be. Remember back 5 years ago? Look, myself, Ozymandias Ramsey II, and who I know he was an amazing philosophy guy.
No, I'm not saying that the problems aren't there, but it's very difficult in the form of a conversation, in the form of an actual dialogue, to show those problems when your partner, the presuppositionalist, it refuses to go off script. This is why Sai's been challenging me to a debate for years and years and years now, and I've said, no, I'm not doing that with you. I'm not doing that with you. I'm not doing that with you. And then finally I came back and I said, all right, I'll have a debate with you, but here's my terms. We're going to write 3 articles. For an opening article, you're going to write an article, it has to be like 600 words or less or something like that. And you have to make an argument for God's existence. And you can use the precept argument, you can use precept method, all you want. And then I get to write an article responding to that argument. And then you can respond again, defending it. And then I can respond, criticizing it again. And then we'll read our arguments. We'll read our papers live on camera, right? We've already written them by this point. We get on camera, we read our arguments out loud, and then following that, we can I'll give you an hour dialogue, a live dialogue. But I am not gonna do this game with you where you're constantly trying to keep me on the defensive, and I don't get to ask questions, and I don't get to I don't get to point out the flaw in your reasoning because you're constantly going, how do you know that? How do you know that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's wonderful. And I think that if we do, I'll arrange it if one of these days, because Scott, Sai trusts me as a moderator, and maybe if we ever do get non sequitur back, that would be awesome for that. But I think your approach is great. He does something, you do something. Now, I tried something similar with Richard Carrier. We had a thing on Facebook where we were basically going back and forth, just the two of us, for like 30 days, right? But I found it went through so many different rabbit holes to be unwieldy, right? I mean, it's just so you have to narrow the scope. You have to say
no. Yeah, it has to be finite. You only get 3.
And then done,
or whatever, and then you got to talk about it because you don't want like longer and longer volleys.
And he didn't want to do that.
Group. Yeah.
But
the point was, once I made that counter offer to Sai, he kind of backed off and said, well, maybe someday, but I'm really busy. And then I checked in with him 6 months later, and he said, I'm still busy. And then I checked in with him 6 months later, and he said, I'm still busy.
No, I'm telling you right now, that's his way of blowing you off. Yeah.
In private, he admitted to me, he said, listen, writing is not my forte. I'm trying to write a book right now, and it's very difficult for me. I'm much more comfortable in the extemporaneous precept script thing, which is what I do. And you got to give me time to if I'm going to do this, it's going to be really difficult for me to write it out. So please respect that. And I said, cool.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. No, like I said, Sai is actually a really nice guy. He means no harm. Does he believe his shit? Yes, he believes his own bullshit. So a couple questions. Sarah had asked if you're still writing a book.
Oh no, I was never writing a book.
Tease.
Thank you for asking. It's been suggested to me. People ask me, "Are you going to write a book? Would you ever write a book?" And I have said in the past, like, "Oh, that would be fun," but I have no idea what.
Yeah, people have asked me to write a
It
book
hasn't
too,
been.
and I was supposed to write have a chapter in Jackson Week's next book. He's writing. He wrote a few books. If you know Jackson Wheat, really awesome dude. He wanted me to write a chapter, but. Yeah, I don't have enough to write a book, but I would love to write a chapter about this stuff. In fact, I don't know why people don't take my blogs and also take Answers and Reasons blogs and run with it. And you could use my shit. I don't mind. But let's see, question. Somebody had asked me if I've seen Rasmussen's platform. Yeah, I've had Josh Rasmussen on the show a few times. He's great. I love theists like that that are willing to engage and have a dialogue, and he's a nice guy. Yeah, those are my favorite kind of conversations. People say, well, how do you have conversations with these theists you don't agree with? Because I don't agree with them. Same thing that you do. I mean, it's just like, why not?
Yeah.
I hate when people tell me who I can and cannot associate with. Like, for example, S.A. Thomason, I get along with her just fine. Like, do I agree with her on anything? No. But,
Yeah.
I mean, I got no issue with her. Weird. Somebody had asked, what would you so somebody had Amir asked, what would Scott say to Graham Oppie, who believes theism to be false but theism as rational, which again is more like friendly atheism?
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I think that theism can be rationally held. I don't
have a problem with that either. I find it to be dishonest when I hear atheists go, well, theism is a form of delusion. A delusion is a malfunction of the mind, and nothing in the DSM or anything like that makes belief delusionary. That means that anybody who ever had a theistic belief, I was a theist at one time, it means I was delusional. No. Can it lead to delusion? I mean, can you have delusions and hear voices and things of that nature? Sure, but merely having an incorrect belief is not the same as having a malfunction of the mind.
Yeah.
And so I don't think anybody should go around saying religion is a mind virus or is delusion, or it's argumentative, it's negative rhetoric, it doesn't have anything of value, discursory.
It's not going to convince anybody of anything.
Nothing. I'm actually really surprised we only had one caller. There got a lot of questions in the live chat coming up, but somebody asked.
What can I say? We're two boring dudes.
You're not as popular as you used to be. Yeah. I know people still think you're Chris Pratt for some strange reason. I don't know.
I'll take it.
Right?
Could be worse.
Somebody asked, what are your thoughts about persons lacking inner monologue? Have you considered, heard how they may differ reasoning about beliefs? I'm not sure of the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. It seems like everybody has some, well, not everybody, but most people that we would consider persons have some kind of inner monologue, as long as they know language. So what's the, I guess I don't get it.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, I think a lot of us reason our own beliefs. I do tend to what's called dosastic involuntarism. I don't think we necessarily choose our own beliefs. I think a mind does it, then we come to the realization, because I can't will myself to believe to fly or something for the most case. But that's, again, our inner conversations. And this is what I think atheists should probably try to work on when it comes to self-justification about why they hold a particular position or why they don't believe. When you and I may disagree with this, but for withholding affirmation or denial of a proposition, that requires some reasoning to be rational. And I wrote a blog called "The Problem with Not Believing," and what it was people that are out there that say they don't believe that I exist. And it's weird to me when I hear that. Well, I don't believe that you exist. I know that you exist, which obviously is contradictory because of justified true belief. But they refuse to have any kind of statement about their own beliefs. And so I'm like, so you don't believe that I exist? Like, no, I don't have any beliefs. Blah blah blah. I'm like, yeah, you do. This is
when I was very
silly.
young, I used to say that. I just took belief. I just misunderstood the word belief, and I used to say, oh, I don't really have beliefs. Yeah. I have, and when I said that, I thought what I was saying, what I thought that I meant that people could understand was that I don't have I don't make claims about things that I couldn't possibly know, or supernatural belief, but it was such fuzzy thinking on my part at that point. Of course you have beliefs. You have nothing but beliefs. You're a belief machine. Like, how could I say I didn't have beliefs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, do you tend to more foundationalism or coherentism? I mean, do you think that they're properly basic beliefs, or do you just think that as long as your belief conforms with other beliefs that you have, they're justified?
Yeah, I don't love the idea of properly basic beliefs. I don't know. By the way, this is an area where I'm not that I can't remember the difference between I know what coherentism means. Foundationalism. Ernest Sosa has a paper called The Pyramid of the Raft, and basically he describes it as foundational beliefs are properly basic beliefs that are not justifiable. They're unwarrantable. They are just irrational, right? They're neither rational nor irrational. Yeah.
And then you form positions on those. Now, I tend to classical foundationalism. That doesn't mean I don't accept coherentism either. I think they're both just fine. But I do think we have properly basic beliefs. For example, like, do I believe that induction will work day to day? Do I think there's a uniformity of nature there? Yes. Can I justify that? No. That's a properly basic belief.
Yeah, but isn't the point of properly basic beliefs that in so being properly basic, that makes them justified automatically? That's the part I don't buy.
Okay, there's some arguments to be had there. As a matter of fact, when I wrote one of my blogs on what's called secondary burdens of justification, I actually included a little blurb in there for that very reason. And I didn't have a lot of pushback on it. I was kind of surprised. But I actually said properly basic beliefs are non-justifiable depending on who you ask. And the reason why I put in that, because there are some people that argue they are non-dosastically inferential or non-dosastically justifiable. I don't know if that's the case. I've read some things on justifications of properly basic beliefs. I hold the position they tend to be non-inferential and non-dosastically justifiable, but there might supposedly be non-inferential or non-dosastic ways of justifying it. I don't have an answer for that, to be honest with you. It's very nuanced, and again, I threw that in there because, again, depending on who you ask or what you read. But I think when we say properly basic, we're just saying that they're not founded on anything else. So you can't say that I believe them and I'm justified to believe them, because what are you basing those justifications on? You'd be basing it on other beliefs, right?
Yeah.
That's why the properly basic.
I just don't like this planting type idea where I just get to label some foundational belief of mine as like off limits. Mm-hmm. Like, no, it's justified because I said it's justified.
It's arbitrary. Like no, that's the problem with foundationalism.
This is the kind of belief in God. That is the kind of belief that's already justified unto itself.
Well, he believes in reformed epistemology.
Do that. Come on.
Yeah.
Well, I know people who are fans of planting are going to be furious at me for.
He's a smart dude, but I disagree with his theodicies. I disagree with his stance on the evidential problem of evil. But he's a very brilliant guy. But I think what he's describing, he's not describing a properly basic belief in his reformed epistemology. He says God is properly basic. I disagree with that 1,000%. I think he has a basic belief, but properly basic beliefs are things that have to be universal. And in my ontology, it is not universal that you have to have a God belief, right? So it can't be a properly basic belief to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we got deep. We got deep here. What the hell happened? This is.
What happened?
We got really deep into this stuff. What the hell happened?
Did? Yeah. Wow, look at the time.
Yeah. We do. We should wrap it up. I want people to be able to digest this stuff, but we'll have another discussion on this stuff, and maybe if you want, if you find time, we'll have a call and I just have once every other month or whenever you're free, do this.
We can do that.
Plus, I love the fact that you're able to go on Discord and we kind of like suss things out on Discord.
Discord's been great. That's Shannon Q introduced me to that, and I'm
not a fan of Discord, but if I go into Discord and we have discussions, I'm okay with that. But it's unwieldy to me. Discord is unwieldy. I've never been a fan of it, but I like the fact that you're going in there and you're like, hey, I got this argument I want to test out. Let's discuss it. That's great. Yeah. I do the same thing. I write my blog at 3 a.m. right, and so. A lot of times I think to myself, is this coherent? Does it make sense? I have no fucking idea. I wrote one on modal logic, and I got to tell you, to this day, I still don't know if it fucking makes sense or not. I really don't. But I'm like, hey, let's put it out there. I'm not afraid of somebody go, Like, for example, my Gumballs and God essay was reviewed by Landon. I think it's unassailable. My WASP argument has been pretty much reviewed. I think that's they're strong. But I have other blogs where people go, "Hey, Steve, what the hell were you thinking?" You know, I'll be like, "Yeah, I fucked up. Whatever." I don't care. I think that if you don't test the waters and run arguments to solidify them, then you're not doing something right. And I love the fact that you are not afraid to do that. And I shouldn't say I need. I wish more people, both theist and atheist, would try to formulate newer arguments, newer positions, and put things out there. They don't need to be afraid of being wrong, right?
Yeah.
That's my little spiel.
Yeah, I mean, fresh meat is always nice.
Yeah. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you guys for watching. Links in the video description. I want to thank the Super Chats. I want to thank my mods. Tomorrow we have Caffeine Corner at 2 o'clock, and I think we might actually have a special episode that I'm arranging at 4 o'clock afterwards, but I'm not going to give out the details of that yet. I'll tell Scott if he doesn't hang up right away. So just stick around for a second because I'll fill you in on something.
Sure.
But guys, thanks for watching the discussion table. Again, I'm going to do this show every so often, but I still have my Steve Sunday School because people have been asking about that. But with that, guys, thanks for watching. Peace.
Thanks.